Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Marlena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So, Tim, you just came back from Victoria and Vancouver. How was your trip?
Well, it was beautiful. I certainly picked a good time to go because as you were all suffering through 116 degrees in California, it was 72 degrees in Canada. So I look pretty smart in hindsight. I didn't plan it that way, but I look pretty smart in hindsight. I even had to wear a jacket. It was cool at night. And at the hotel that we stayed at the Oak Bay Beach Hotel in Victoria. They even brought out blankets for you to wear to, as you were dining and enjoying the beautiful view on the deck out back. So it was lovely. And it was an interesting time to be there, of course, with the passing of the Queen. And as we were in on Thursday morning, the morning she passed, we had plans to go have tea at the Empress Hotel, which is one of those kind of tick off the list things you need to do when you're in Victoria. And despite it being over $100, it was very well worth it. Well, as we arrived at the hotel was right when the Queen passed, and we actually saw them. Kitty corner from the Empress is the Victoria. It's the British Columbia legislature. The capital of British Columbia, their legislature building is right there in the inner harbor in Victoria, and it's kind of kitty corner from the hotel. So we actually got to see the moment in history watching them lower the flag to half staff. So it was interesting. And then on Friday, I took a little tour of the Capitol, and they actually had out the condolence books that you could sign to the royal family. So a beautiful thing to see. It was an interesting trip. It was definitely a cool experience in more than one ways, and certainly temperature-wise. And an interesting historical time to be there.
Our Sally Pipes, who is president of PRI, she mentioned the other day to me that when she was a little girl living in Canada, and we forget that Canada is part of the Commonwealth, that when along with O Canada, they also sang God Save the Queen every morning before she started school.
It was kind of interesting, the reaction on Canadian television, and I don't know the average thought. There certainly were flowers and being laid in tribute on the Capitol grounds, but the television coverage was all about kind of, did the Queen reckon enough for the treatment by the English of the First Nations people in Canada, and did they apologize sufficiently for England's role in the slave trade? So I don't know how that portends for the future of whether Canada will remain a member of the Commonwealth, but I thought that was interesting that these sort of, kind of more woke PC considerations were the primary focus of the coverage in Canada of the Queen's death.
Yeah. So what were some of the highlights? I loved is it the Bouchard Gardens in Vancouver? Did you get a chance to see those? I thought they were among the most beautiful gardens I've ever seen in the world.
We did. When we arrived, we took the ferry from Seattle and we took a bus. They had a round trip bus from the ferry to there, and then they dropped you off at the Empress afterwards, and they dropped your luggage off at the hotel while you were there. And I thought the exact same thing. It was beautiful, and especially the sunken gardens, which if you've never been there, kind of go off on this little path and you're not quite sure what you're going to see. Well, then you come to this kind of balcony, and there's probably a 3 or 4 story drop. You go by stairs, of course, and the most beautiful gardens for as far as the eye can see. We were there at just the right point where it was still everything kind of in bloom for summer, but it was, you could tell fall, was kind of up upon us. So it was, I'm glad we got the opportunity to go see that. I mean, that definitely, if you go, you have to go. It's a beautiful place to see. You can also do tea. They have a beautiful, in the old mansion where the family lived, they have tea there as well. So if you want to tick off your tea that would be another beautiful place to go.
Now, did you still have to put up with this app that they make you do to fill out about your COVID status? I think it's called Arrive Canada. It was the biggest hassle for me when I was in Canada earlier this year. And the funny thing is that after you go through all of this hassle, which I was in Canada around May, you get to the airport and they don't really care. I wave all my paperwork and my app, and they're like barely glanced at it. So what happened to you?
Well, we had to fill out all of that, and the ferry company actually sent us a how-to guide of how to fill it up. And I feel like I'm a pretty tech-savvy person. I needed it to figure out, what to fill in on all the points there. So it probably took me over half an hour to fill out that form for everybody. And I had the exact same issue. They looked at it when we boarded the cruise in Seattle just to show that we had it. I don't think anybody looked at it when we went through customs when we arrived in Victoria. We had to show our passport. We had to give the form, like you normally do when you go in and out of the country. But that was it. We didn't have to show our vaccine card. They didn't ask about it at all. So I wondered what was the point of all of this if nobody really looked at it.
Well, here in California, I looked the other day, and cases have been dropping since July for the state, and as well as Los Angeles. Daily deaths in LA are down to the teens, but the cases are still up there, a couple thousand cases a day. But I don't really trust those numbers now, because say if you test using the home test, then you're not likely to report it to the city. So I'm sure that there are thousands of cases a day, but the point is that deaths are way down, and hospitalizations as well. So the irony is so that we still have to wear a mask in the Uber. I believe it's still official at the airport too, but I would say 50% of the airport personnel and most of the passengers are not wearing masks.
Yeah, hardly anybody in the United States wore a mask. Even they didn't require it on the Ubers. On the ferry there, you didn't have to wear it there, but you did have to wear it upon arrival to go through customs. Now, in and around town, there are definitely more mask wearers. And in a couple of the attractions we went to, it was mandatory to wear a mask, and they were kind of snippy about it. But I would say probably about 30 to 40% of folks wearing masks.
There are two vaccines out now for the Omicron variant, one from Moderna and one from Pfizer. I think I'm going to wait a bit, Tim, before I get it. I got the second booster, and I want to do more research on it. Not because I'm concerned about it, but I want to know how long the booster is going to last. If it's only a couple of months, I'd rather wait until the fall to get it during peak, so that it doesn't kind of wane, in December or so. So I'm gonna do a little more research on it.
I've been wondering, how do you know when you go to the pharmacy that you're getting the new one? Well, I did some research on that, and apparently in the emergency use authorization from the FDA allowing for this newly updated vaccine to be administered, they actually have changed it so that it no longer is authorized to give the original vaccine as a booster shot. Oh. So they said you should feel pretty confident that whether it says it's the updated one or not, that you are getting the updated one. Now, how that translates to what your pharmacy will actually give you, that's another question. But, it is the intent that from now on, only new shots will be given as boosters.
Well, we're hopefully past the COVID era, but we still can't forget that COVID killed more than 1 million Americans in this country, and what's the figure? I think it's more than 6 million around the world. And I think there's a growing consensus that the virus came from the lab in Wuhan, even though there's still a lot of questions unanswered.
Well, I usually believe if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, smells like a duck, it usually is a duck. So, there are many great questions in life that we kind of think we know what happened, but we're not really sure. I think that's probably one here, but there's no doubt in my mind, whether in a sinister way or whether it was a true accident, that it originated in China. and probably in some kind of lab.
That leads us to our special guest. Thank you, Tim. Our guest this week is John O'Neill. Listeners might remember that John was the author of Unfit for Command, which was a bestseller book on John Kerry's tour of Vietnam. And I had the privilege of being his editor when he wrote that book. But now he has a new book out called The Dancer and the Devil, the dancer being the famous ballerina Anna Pavlova and the devil being Stalin. So John makes a case that it was actually Stalin who was responsible for Pavlova's mysterious and sudden death. He goes on to talk about how bioweapons have been the weapon of choice for communist countries who wanted to go after the enemies of the state, and have a historical record of using bioweapons. We also talk about coronavirus, which, as he absolutely believes, originated from Wuhan.
Yeah, it's I thought Unfit for Command was a terrific book. I didn't know you until we interviewed him. I didn't know you had a connection to it. He really is a great storyteller. And so I think you'll all enjoy hearing, the whole story and what he has to say. And I think it's definitely a book to add to your fall reading list.
Yes, and John is still at the top of his game. He is an attorney and still writing and still very active. So thanks very much for listening. And here's John O'Neill. Welcome to Next Round, John.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be on your show.
And it's an honor for us to have you on Next Round. So, John, your latest book is an historical account of the use of bioweapons and poison by communist regimes. What inspired you to write The Dancer and the Devil?
What happened really, Rowan, is when I was in Vietnam, I saw, and earlier in Hong Kong, I saw a lot of people killed by the communists. And I thought, as I grew older, I thought, God, I hope these people aren't lost to history. They were wonderful people. And of course, in the 20th century, there were maybe as many as 60 million people slaughtered by the Russian communists, the Chinese communists, and the like. So I began to look at cases that I thought would be of great public interest because they were almost unsolved mysteries. And the first of these was the great ballerina Pavlova, probably history's greatest ballerina, whose death had been mysterious. That led me to the Russian poison lab established by Stalin called Laboratory 1. And I learned that Laboratory 1 didn't just end with Stalin, but that Stalin had created massive bioweapons laboratories at Saratov and other locations, and that these had spread throughout the communist world to North Korea and then to China. I learned that Putin had reactivated Russia's bioweapons program and had a huge program, and I learned of China's program. And so when COVID-19 occurred and leaked at Wuhan, China, I knew instantly, I think, where it was and what it was from. And that's what led Sarah Wynn, my co-author, and I in the direction that we traveled.
So you focus your research on the most famous ballerina of the day, Anna Pavlova. So set the stage for us. Tell us about Anna Pavlova and why Stalin would want to eliminate artists and writers and musicians and dancers during his regime.
Tim, there are 37 biographies of Anna Pavlova, and there's never been anybody that studied her or wrote about her that other than fell in love with her, including both Sarah and I. She was a small, roughly 5 feet 1 inch ballerina who was an orphan. And she came in, she had a mother, but no father. She came into the ballet, the Imperial Ballet. They rejected her initially. And then a guy named Marius Petita, who is the founding figure in many ways of modern ballet, the guy that choreographed any number of ballets, The Nutcracker, Pharaoh's Daughter, Sleeping Beauty. At any rate, he was an old man by then. He was in his 80s, and he saw her dance for the very first time. And as he describes it, she was the dream of every ancient ballet master. It was because there were other great athletic dancers. There were other people who could do moves that were hard to duplicate. But what Anna Pavlova could do was convey emotion, incredible emotion, as she danced. And so in some ways, her frailty and weakness was her strength. She became really famous in 1904 at a party that the Romanovs held. It was the Winter Ball. And there she danced extracts from the Swan Lake and other dances, and that made her famous throughout Russia. She left Russia in 1910 with the Ballet Russe and danced for the first time in Paris. And from there, she became famous all over the world. People said it was as if her feet never touched the ground, and that when you watched her, you could see the difference between life and death. Her most famous vignette was a short ballet called The Dying Swan. And The Dying Swan is really based on an ancient Greek parable of a swan, which in its very last moments of life can really speak for the very first time. And so it tells the story of a swan, the last few minutes of its life. And to some people, it is the great tragedy of death as you watch it, as the swan slowly goes to the ground. To many others, it's a truly a parable of the line between life and death, a story of resurrection. And she danced it over 4,000 times. It became the most famous vignette in all of ballet. As a matter of fact, 2 months ago, it was danced all over the world by 40-some ballerinas in 40 different countries to try and raise money to combat COVID-19. And so it's danced even today. She became the seminal figure of ballet in the world, and really the representation of Russia to the whole world. She happened to be out of Russia when the Bolsheviks took control. And so she was in the West, and she never came back to Russia again. She was never able to after the Bolsheviks took over. And so by the 1920s, she was the face of Russia to the entire world. And she was an instant reminder of the great culture of Imperial Russia. Their great ballets, Swan Lake and The Nutcracker. And she was also a seminal force in aiding orphans, refugees that were located by this time all over Europe. In 1925, Stalin declared that he would destroy the very word God in Russia by 1935, within 10 years. And he began what was often called the first great cultural revolution. And he began to execute at least one ballerina, several people that composed ballet. They would either disappear, sometimes they'd be poisoned, sometimes they would be openly executed as traitors. His theory was that, and based on the writings of a man named Gramsci, that Marxism, it wasn't enough for Marxism to simply control banks and oil companies and the like. Marxism had to control the mind of man itself. So you had to control the actual language. Words like God had to be eliminated completely from the language of man, and dances that were improper or inconvenient bits of history had to be destroyed, because he who controls the present controls the past. And of course, in the Ukraine, by way of example, there were the music of the Ukraine was like Western music in the West, and it was played with a guitar called a Kobar. And the Kobars also became the name of the musicians. They were all summoned to Kiev in the Ukraine to form a union by Stalin in 1930-31. And so they came, 370 of them. They were told they were going to get on a train to go to Moscow to meet with the leadership. They got on the train, and 10 miles out of town, they were taken off the train, and all 370 of them were executed. Their instruments were all destroyed. And it was made a capital offense, a death penalty offense in the Ukraine, to sing their songs or to use their guitars, even use a kobar. So a woman like Anna Pavlova, dancing free all over the world, and a symbol of Russian culture all over the world, and of freedom, of human freedom, was an incredible challenge to Stalin, and one he couldn't permit to happen.
Now, John, Anna Pavlova died suddenly and mysteriously. So tell us about how she died and why you think Stalin was behind it.
In 1927, Anna Pavlova and her companion, great figure in ballet, a man named Sergei Diaghilev, were both declared enemies of the Soviet state. They were both invited back to Russia by Stalin, but refused to return to Russia. After they refused to return, the Russian government the communist government passed a law that said if you're invited to return, you don't return, it's a capital offense. So even as a matter of law, they were subject to execution in Russia. In 1927, they were both declared enemies of the Soviet state. In 1929, Diaghilev died under very mysterious circumstances in Russia. And in 1930, Pavlova danced throughout Europe, and Stalin's likely mistress, and certainly Stalin's leading ambassador, a woman named Anna Kollontai, went throughout Europe trying to get governments to block Anna Pavlova from dancing at all at the instance of Stalin. And she danced anyway, and the governments laughed it off. In Moscow, Stalin had set up a poison lab called Laboratory Number 1. And they had a poisoning gang set up in Paris. The name of that gang was the Yasha Gang. It's the most famous of all assassin gangs in human history, although we knew nothing about it until the 1990s. And the book relates the people in it. An astounding group of assassins. One of them said, any fool can commit a murder. It takes an artist to stage a natural death or a suicide. And so in 1930, Anna Pavlova was in great danger. Her friends in Hollywood tried to get her to go back to Hollywood and to make a movie there. She had great offers. She refused to do that. She told her friends that she felt like there was a sword of Damocles over her head, and she asked them to pray for her because she didn't think she was going to be around very long. And she scheduled nonetheless her tour, and her tour was to take her right to Poland, right to the border of Russia, right close to the great Miranowski Theater, where she had actually danced in her early career. She ate dinner. She was in perfect health. She ate lunch at the Ritz Hotel in Paris in January of 1931, en route to the opening performance, which was going to occur in The Hague in front of the King Queen of Belgium. And immediately after eating lunch in the Ritz, she went, which she had delivered to her room. Quite important. She had delivered to her room. She left immediately and climbed on the train. As soon as she got on the train, she told everyone who would listen that she had been poisoned at the Ritz by the food in the Ritz Hotel. They all thought it was ridiculous. Who would poison the world's most beloved ballerina? Just crazy. So they treated her. Her lungs began to fill up with fluid. And the doctors tried to operate, tried to drain her lung, but they couldn't. Stalin, at this point in time, was using anthrax. Anthrax are a set of spores, and anthrax in your lungs simulates pneumonia. And he killed a large number of people using anthrax. Had a project called the Anthrax Project at Saratov in Russia. At any rate, her lungs began to fill up with water. She summoned her company in. Everything they tried to do couldn't help her. And they summoned her company in, and she made them promise that they would go forward the very next night. They handed her swan costume, dying swan costume. She made the sign of the cross, and she died. And the very next night in The Hague, they went forward with the performance. And all the places she was supposed to dance, all her mark, they shined a spotlight because they said there was no one in the world who could take the place of Anna Pavlova. There was no one who could dance like that. In Hollywood, her friends, it was a mystery, a mysterious death. You couldn't prove how it was caused, like all of the Stalin deaths in those days. And what they did do is they made the movie The Grand Hotel. The Grand Hotel was the Oscar winner for Best Picture in 1932, but it won no individual Oscars at all. And her friends, like John Barrymore, acted in that movie, which is about a doomed ballerina, a doomed Russian ballerina. And it was their way of paying tribute to Anna Pavlova. After her death, the Russian government instantly stepped in, tried to claim ownership of her entire estate from her husband and forced the liquidation of her ballet schools and her company and the like, but they couldn't wipe out her memory. She remains, even today, the greatest of all dancers and the greatest of all ballerinas.
Let's talk a little more about this use of poison. You know, communist regimes have used poisons and bioweapons throughout history. So could you discuss some other occasions when this has happened and why you think poison, of all things, has been their weapon of choice?
Well, the origin of all this in the Soviet world was in 1921, when the war on the churches began, and there were 11 high officials of the Orthodox Church executed in Moscow. And they marched out into the square, and they were singing the Russian hymn, Jesus Christ is risen today. And the crowd turned sympathy and immediately began singing, truly he is risen. And so although they shot him, there was a huge set of riots in Moscow. And from this, the Soviets and Bolsheviks concluded that they had to get rid of people secretly and silently so that there wouldn't be any great last speech. There wouldn't be any Nathan Hale. And of course, for most people, they could simply have them disappear, shot in the back of the head, and you roll them into an anonymous grave. And that happened to hundreds of thousands of people. But there were people that you couldn't do this to. They were so famous and so prominent, they couldn't simply disappear. One was the great writer Gorky. Gorky came back to Russia in 1933 at the invitation of Stalin. He concluded Stalin was a monster. He said Stalin was like a flea on Gorky was a communist, but he regarded Stalin as a flea that was magnified by events into a horrific monster. So Gorky had to be eliminated. Of course, what happened is Gorky developed the very same pneumonia, supposed pneumonia, that had happened to Anna Pavlova. There were a whole sequence of people. There's a lot of reason to believe that Stalin killed Lenin in exactly the same way, although that's by no means certain. Their whole sequence or list of people that he killed. Typically, he would kill them, and then the executioners themselves would be killed. Well, on occasion, the executioners would get tried, and as in the 1938 purge trials, they would confess, "Oh yes, we poisoned Gorky," which they did. They confessed we poisoned. They weren't allowed, of course, to say that it was at Stalin's behest. Instead, they simply went down as poisoners, and they were executed and then replaced by a whole new group of poisoners. Stalin began with using typical poisons and then moved on to bioweapons like most prominently anthrax, which is the bioweapon of choice that he used over and over again.
Now, Russia hasn't been the only communist country using poison to eliminate enemies. You also write about North Korea. Tell us about the sophisticated labs that they've developed.
Yes, Marxism has a problem. And Marxism's problem is that it promises heaven, and it promises ultimate human freedom, and it delivers slavery, and it delivers squalid conditions, usually run by a single Mr. Kim or a single Stalin or a single Mao or a single Xi. And so it can't survive debate. It never has been able to survive a free debate. And so it has to eliminate dissenters. It has to eliminate the people who question why or what's going on or this isn't what you promised. And for most of them, a bullet in the back of the head or disappearance goes, but there are always people like Pavlova or Gorky or others. And so you have to have a way of dealing with them. And that method of dealing with them is poison, and both organic and inorganic poisons, both bioweapons and other poisons. In North Korea, there is a terrible poison facility. We saw it used by the Kims on the half-brother of the Kims in the airport in Malaysia, where he was simply touched unknowingly and then died a horrific death under a poison that North Korea had developed. North Korea has human labs that they use. A truck actually arrives. They pick up prisoners from the prison camps and they take them off, and they test organic and inorganic poisons on them, and they kill them to develop highly professional poisons. We know about this from actual guards who have defected, as well as one prisoner who has escaped, and they've testified under oath. Their testimony and a recount of what they had to say is in the book, The Dancer and the Devil, in the chapter on North Korea.
So you also write about COVID-19 and the virus that originated from Wuhan. Could you talk about the history of China's use of bioweapons?
China originally was a victim of bioweapons. The Japanese used bioweapons in Shanghai and are believed to have killed as many as 200,000 people. The Japanese had a huge bioweapons facility in Manchuria using American prisoners of war, as well as the Chinese, as sort of test rats in the same way the Russians have done and Chinese likely are still doing, and the North Koreans certainly have done. After the conquest of China by the communists in 1949, there were large bioweapons facilities set up throughout China in the Stalinist period. And with the break between the Russians and the Chinese continued with these and expanded them. The Chinese bioweapons facilities infected the entire world in 1977. 1955, there was a flu that went all over the world, misnamed the Russian flu. It killed millions of people. It reappeared in exactly the same form in 1977, 22 years later. Can't happen. This is like me visiting Marina 50 years from now and being exactly the same. Flus always mutate. They change and mutate. So exactly the same flu can't reappear, but it did. And so scientists all over the world said this flu had to have been stored in China. It has to have been stored there and has to have somehow leaked. And the Chinese said, we know nothing about it. What are you talking about? We know absolutely nothing. Over 1 million people died from the 1977 flu. And in 1994, the head of the Chinese virology program confessed, yes, in fact, what had happened was they had stored the 1955 flu. They were developing a vaccine for the 55 flu using Army troops. And it had, in this vaccine testing, had gotten out. And that's how they infected the entire world. Understand, the only reason you develop a vaccine to a flu that exists only in cold storage on your lab is so that you can use it as a bioweapon. If I develop a bug or a virus, it's of no use for me as a weapon unless I can keep my own people safe. So that's exactly what they were doing in 1977. They leaked again in 1988, according to Russian intelligence, killed a large number of people in northwest China. So the COVID-19 experience was not the first time. It was at least the third or fourth time that the Chinese bioweapons facilities leaked. There were also huge leaks in the Russian facilities in 1972 and 79. And what happened is in the United States, we developed a tool called the CRISPR tool. The CRISPR tool, it's like all the things that man seems to develop, like nuclear power. It has both a good and a bad side. The good side is that you can edit actually viruses, change them, and develop new viruses and new gene therapies to actually help people. The terrible side of it is it makes possible for the very first time the creation of diseases, of new viruses that never existed in nature at all, that are actually designed by man himself. That the CRISPR tool began in the West around 2010. In the United States, our government in 2015 specifically outlawed the use of the CRISPR tool to modify viruses. There were scientists who wanted to do it in laboratories, saying, wait, if we enhance viruses, we can anticipate future diseases. But the risk was too great, the risk of leaking. And so in the Obama administration, it was outlawed. Great deal of evidence now shows that that technology of editing viruses actually was taken to China. In 2018, the Wuhan laboratory, together with two American enterprises, applied for grant money in the United States to take a COVID virus and edit it. It was turned down as illegal in the United States. A year later, the COVID virus showed up in that very same altered form with the hook, showed up in China in December of 2019. COVID virus is 96.5% identical to a virus found in horseshoe bats located 1,100 miles from Wuhan in the Himalayas, in a cave in the Himalayas, and brought to Wuhan to their laboratory in 2015. It has never been found anywhere else on Earth. And the last 3.2% of it has never been found anywhere in nature at all. In December of 2019, a brave doctor, Dr. Li, a whistleblower in China, put on the internet a strange new virus has appeared here in Wuhan. And he worked at the hospital near the Wuhan lab. He was immediately arrested for disclosing state secrets, and he died under mysterious short circumstances a few weeks later. The Chinese still permitted immigration into most of the world, but and initially, after some skepticism, finally disclosed that there was some new virus, but claimed it had nothing to do with the nearby Wuhan lab. They claimed it came from a fish market. Understand, this would require, they claimed it was a bat from the Himalayas somehow flying 1,100 miles to Wuhan and mating with some unknown creature that produced this difference, all occurring on the footsteps of the Wuhan Biowar Lab in Wuhan, China. Of course, it was a ridiculous claim. Nonetheless, a worldwide search was launched to try and find that virus, the COVID-19 virus, anywhere in nature. It has never been found. Millions and millions of dollars have been spent trying to find it, and it never will be found because it was created in a lab. And of course, the participants in the search all know that. It's like a snipe hunt. They're searching for something they know doesn't exist in nature. It is the first man-made virus that mankind has ever encountered. And hopefully, each of us have to pray, not the last. We all have to pray that it's the last, that we won't encounter some other terrible thing like this. It has killed over 18 million people in the world and 1,200,000 people in the United States. More than all the wars in the history of the United States have died so far of COVID-19.
John, do you think we'll ever get at the truth of what happened?
Yes, I think we have the truth. I just don't think we're acknowledging the truth. I think that our government, I think that the NIH is embarrassed at their connection with this, that the technology effectively was America, a lot of it was American technology. I think that they are embarrassed that they suggested doing this with the Chinese, although it was turned down. And I think that as early emails say of the NIH, they say, look, if this is anti-science and it would disturb greatly our relationship with our Chinese colleague. And but look, science is not kind of seeking a political solution. Science is the search for truth. And the truth they know, and I think any responsible scientist knows, is that virus is a created virus, created in a laboratory, and that it was somehow got out of the laboratory. Hopefully it was leaked. I speculate it was another vaccine test, like the vaccine test that occurred in 1977, but we don't know at this point how it got out of the Wuhan laboratories, but we know that's where it came from. That's where it appeared, on the doorstep of those laboratories. We know that they had the horseshoe bat involved, and they were doing exactly the same procedure that caused COVID-19 to be so lethal. So, Benny, to me, we know the truth. We just have to acknowledge the truth now. Very much like the truth we always knew that the color of a human being doesn't determine their character or the type of person they are. But we went through a period of trying to pretend something different, and that's what we're doing still with the COVID virus. COVID-19 virus was created in a Chinese laboratory, and it's a created virus, and it was leaked in those laboratories in Wuhan. And we know that as surely as we know that somebody's color or their religion doesn't make them everything that they are.
So finally, you are the famous author of Unfit for Command, which I have a copy of on my bookshelf. And for our listeners, this book is on John Kerry's tour of Vietnam. And you were able to successfully thwart John Kerry's presidential bid. Now, it's been nearly 20 years since then. Do you have any reflections you could offer up to our listeners about that time and that project?
What happened is I had just given a kidney to my wife, Anne, in 2004. And so I turned on the television, and there was John Kerry in a leather jacket. And I thought it was a joke. It said he was going to be, I knew what a clown John Kerry was. And I thought it must be a joke. He was in a leather jacket, pretending to be a Vietnam veteran, and said that, pretending to be a war hero anyway. That was his sort of costume. And he, it said he was the presumptive Democratic nominee. Well, I then got stuff from our commanding officer, Admiral Hoffman, and he said, General Quarters, we've got a real emergency, because we all knew what John Kerry was, and the idea that he would be president of the United States was horrifying to us. What was particularly horrifying, we lost a lot of people in Vietnam. They were good people. Kids, 19, 20, 21, 22, had wives, kids, they're all there. They're all volunteers. And, they're making $100 or $200 a month. They're not exactly there for the pay. They're there because they love our country. And Kerry had come back to the United States and claimed we were the army of Genghis Khan, that we were ravaging, murdering, and so on. And that was a lie, a terrible, terrible lie. And it was very devastating to the wives, the children, and so on of all those people. and to the rest of us. Well, we all survived it, but here was this jerk running for president of the United States and now purporting to be a great war hero, which he wasn't either. And so that's how I got involved. And I wrote the book with others, the book Unfit for Command, with the cooperation of virtually everybody in our unit. Kerry claimed after his defeat that the book and our group, Swiftboat Veterans, was responsible for his defeat. I'm not sure if that's true, but if it was, I'm thrilled that it was. I think that other than giving a kidney to my wife, Anne, I thought that was probably the greatest thing I ever did in my life. And so I'm very, very proud of having participated in that. I'm sorry that people like Kerry sometimes seem to still be rising to the top in the United States. But you can't do everything. But at least we did the very best we could. So I regarded it as the most honorable service that I ever performed in my life in terms of helping our country.
Well, John, I was honored and privileged to be your editor on that book, and it is truly one of my great accomplishments as well, looking back on my career.
I'm after the passage of years, I tell stories about you still to this day, Rowena.
Oh, thank you, John.
This book had to deal in part with combat. And so we would write out, and the book was all edited in a short period of time, as Rowena remembers, a month or so. And Rowena would read what we had written, and she'd say, I don't understand this. And so we'd say, well, you can. And then we realized if Rowena, who is bright, very bright, doesn't understand this, nobody would understand it. And so we'd redo it because we were using too much Navy jargon and too much sort of in-house Vietnam jargon. But you were a fabulous editor, Rowena, and that book never would have come to press without you, not for a minute. And so I want you to know that's something I've thought about for 20 years. I've told stories about you all that time.
John, I'm almost in tears. Thank you so much.
Well, that is absolutely the truth. As a matter of fact, I talked about you just the other day.
Oh, thank you. Well, John, we call our podcast Next Round because we have fantastic wineries here in California, and we like to ask our guests for a wine, beer, or cocktail recommendation for our listeners. So what are you enjoying these days as you celebrate your new book?
Well, the best single wine I ever had no longer exists, and it was Paul Meyer. And it was when Paul Meyer was still, a little cult wine out in the Napa Valley. But the wines I would talk about are the South African wines. This is heresy. I'm sorry, Rowena, since you're in California, but definitely the South African wines from the Table Rock, on top of the Table Rock in Cape Town, as well as of course, the great Bordeaux in France. I've loved the Bordeaux my whole life. They're all too expensive now, but you can still find great California wines and great Bordeaux for relatively inexpensive prices if you're willing to, search a little bit.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a great honor.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.